Hello, true crimerers. 'Tis the season and shit. Here's another compilation video for ya. It is the third and final one of the Coldest Cases by State series that I have on TikTok. Cold weather, Santa, Christmas. I hate my life. So this is going to take us from Iowa down to my home state of Arizona. And then I have two more states to do, which I will put out in a video for tomorrow. And that will wrap it up, baby. As usual, yes, this is in TikTok format. And I'm jingling everywhere. So it's going to be the vertical format, and most of you hate it, but some of you don't care, so it is what it is. I can't change it. Sorry. At the end of the video, if you haven't seen the other compilation videos of this series, I'll put one of those little, square boxes up top that says, click this video for the next one. And you can link to the other video in this series. Yay. All right, true crimerers. Without further ado, here is the next 12 coldest cases by state. Viewer discretion, you bunch of ho-ho-hos, is advised. Was a true crime TV show responsible for a woman being arrested and charged with the murder of her former husband? Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State. Today, we're going to Iowa. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was 20-year-old Stephen Fisher. He lived in Newton, Iowa, and in 1983, he had just recently separated from his wife. Her name is Teresa Supino. The two of them had not officially divorced, but they were going through the separation process. Stephen had begun to date 17-year-old Melissa Gregory. Stephen worked at a ranch called the Copper Dollar, and on the morning of March 3rd, 1983, he would be discovered there, deceased. He was found lying on a bench completely naked inside of the camper on the ranch that he slept in. There was blood all over around his head, and initially they thought he had been shot to death. About 50 feet away from the camper, they then found the body of Melissa Gregory. She, too, looked like she had been shot in the head. It would later be determined that they actually were not shot. Both of them had been bludgeoned to death over the head. Police would look at this as a crime of passion. Typically, when someone is bashing you over the head, it's usually out of anger, and typically, it's someone that at least one of them knew. One of the biggest issues from the get-go with the crime scene is there wasn't a significant amount of evidence left behind. This is also in the very early stages of DNA. They found some shoe impressions, but it was kind of hard to distinguish since this was a popular ranch with many people who worked there. They didn't really find any fingerprints. Now, back in 1981, the ranch had been used to sell drugs. The ranch's owner at the time was a low-key drug dealer. Stephen Fisher actually knew about the drug situation, as one time he was given $30,000 to complete a deal. But apparently the drug angle was just never thoroughly checked into. And then the case went cold for 30 plus years. That is until the show Cold Justice got involved. Now, eventually they would come to the conclusion that this was likely a crime of passion, just like police said back in 1983. But not with much physical evidence, so they had to rely on circumstantial evidence. They would uncover information that Stephen's former wife, Teresa, allegedly her brother said that she told him that she was there at the ranch the night of the murders. The show would also come to the conclusion that she likely knew about this relationship that Stephen had and possibly got jealous, maybe even angry. So she was arrested and charged with the murders because of it, even though there was not a single shred of physical evidence to connect her to the scene. She too said, "I think it's the drug angle." She would go through a trial and was acquitted. And now their murder is still unsolved. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State, and today we are going to Indiana. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, this is an interesting one because in some regards, it's considered solved, but in reality, It's not. I'll explain, of course. This is also referred to as the LaSalle Street murders. So this here is 1318 North LaSalle Street in Indianapolis, Indiana. On the morning of December 1st, 1971, 3 bodies would be discovered inside the home, each in a different room. Each victim had their legs and arms tied, and they had all had their throats cut. The victims were 30-year-old Robert Hinson. There was also Robert Gierce, and then finally James Barker. Now, Hinson and Gierce, they're the ones who lived in the home. Barker was just there visiting on the night of the murders, so this was a wrong place, wrong time for him. All 3 of them were considered businessmen. Oh, he's happy. Oh. Hinson and Gierce used to work for this man, Ted Euland. Apparently it was some kind of microfilming business, but then the 2 men would leave that job to start their own microfilming business. But they did something naughty. Not only did they pry away clients from Ted Euland, they also stole some, equipment, money. Not great. Now, Ted Euland had actually taken out life insurance policies on his employees, including these 2 men. That policy was set to expire a week or so after these murders took place. The money he actually was able to get. So it seems like signed, sealed, delivered. Here's our guy. But he had an alibi for the night of the murders. It was a rock-solid, airtight, confirmed alibi. He was nowhere even near the city when it took place. He was hours away. Now, it's also rumored that these 3 men had a little bit of a chart for how many women they could bed. This included several women who were married. So police also investigated the route of, probably a husband found out and got pissed. One of those husbands was this man, Carol Horton. He would actually be indicted and arrested for the murders. But then there was no evidence whatsoever to pin him to the crime scene. So the case was dropped. Someone even said President Nixon ordered the hit and Jimmy Hoffa took it out, and then he disappeared. In 2001, a letter surfaced from a dead man's safety deposit box. The dead man, Fred Harbison, said Ted Euland hired him to take out the hit, but Ted never paid him. The letter was verified, but is it true? Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State, and today we're going to Illinois. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here behind me was 7-year-old Jacqueline Willoughby. Her and her family lived in Midlothian, Illinois. Jacqueline was the biological daughter of Cynthia, and she was the adopted daughter of David, and then this was David's son. They lived here in this house, and it was a very peaceful neighborhood. Peaceful until September 10th, 1988. Shortly before 7 a.m. on that September 10th day, David and his son would wake up, and everyone else in the house appeared to be asleep. Something odd though, when David walked towards the front of the house, he noticed that the front door was open. He thought to himself, maybe his mother, because his mother lived there with them, maybe she left the door open. It's happened before. 2 hours later, Cynthia is now awake and she goes to Jacqueline's room to wake her up. But Jacqueline is not in her room. Jacqueline's bed is empty and there is no sign of her anywhere. Not in the house, not outside playing with a friend. They even go across the street to knock on one of their neighbors' doors who Jacqueline plays with. Jacqueline hasn't been there. So they call police, which then brings in the FBI because they were expecting possibly a ransom. However, all of the attention seems to be pointing towards the parents, David and Cynthia. But not knowing where Jacqueline was, there was nothing anyone could do. Just 4 days later, Jacqueline would be found. She was lying in an open field and she was wrapped in her comforter and her nightgown, and she had a rope around her neck. Police would first suspect that possibly her biological father, Jim Guess, maybe he did this, but he had an airtight alibi. They then suspected possibly her biological uncle, Timothy Guess, but he apparently had an alibi at a diner where he worked. He was schizophrenic, He was in and out of jail himself. Now, back at the house, police noticed that their basement window had been broken. At first, police said it looks like it was staged to look like it was broken from the outside, but they said it was broken from the inside. Later, the FBI would say, no, that wasn't the case. The window definitely looked like it was broken from the outside. Police then wondered, well, how did they get into this basement and not disturb any of these items? Well, later they would take video to prove that it was very possible to go into the house this way and not disturb anything. I'm so sorry if you could hear Lola barking in the background. Police then zeroed back in on David and Cynthia, and as a matter of fact, both of them would be arrested and charged with Jacqueline's murder. All they had was circumstantial evidence. What was the circumstantial evidence? Well, somebody said they thought they saw a man who looked kind of like David sitting in a car near the place where Jacqueline's body was eventually found. This witness only saw this man in the car from the side and never from the front. But when the witness was shown a lineup of photographs, all of those photos obviously were from the front. Now, David's photo was made to be the largest photo of the group, which is like this psychological test for, basically them to point to that photo. Their brain is telling them that's the prominent one. So they pointed to David's photo. Police said they also found a blood-stained pillowcase inside of Cynthia's room. They say they also found hairs inside of the trunk of her parents' vehicle, hair that probably belonged to Jacqueline. They also had testimony allegedly from David's son stating that the parents would give Jacqueline spankings quite often. Now, all of this is hearsay, all of this is circumstantial, because they were never able to prove the blood was Jacqueline's, they were never able to prove that those hairs were Jacqueline's. And, many parents spank their kids, especially back then. But the two of them would go on trial, and when it came time to send the jury to make their decision, the judge said, you know what, there is no evidence to really point Cynthia to this at all. So he actually released her from the case and she was free to go. David, however, still went to the jury decision. The jury came back and said he was guilty and he was sentenced. He was given a 45-year jail sentence. Cynthia, the family, their friends, none of them believed David had anything to do with this. The community was pretty strong in favor of David not doing this. Eventually, this would go to the higher courts and his conviction was overturned completely and he was never retried. Now, at this point, the case is unsolved. That being said, the alibi of Timothy Guess, who was the biological uncle of Jacqueline, he said he was at a diner working that night. However, 5 witnesses who were regulars at that diner came forward to say he was definitely not at the diner that night. And then another alibi witness came forward to say that she was wrong. Timothy spoke to a journalist once, and he said he was shown like a dream of what happened to Jacqueline. And then he knew details about the crime scene, even though he never actually had been in the house, ever. The evidence is pretty strong against him, but he died in 2002. So sadly, the case of Jacqueline de Willoughby is still officially unsolved. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State. Today, we're going to Idaho. And this is the case of the Lewis Clark Valley murders. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, this case is called the Lewis Clark Valley murders because it takes place in the Lewiston-Clarkston area of Idaho. And it involves the disappearances/murders of 5 people, at least. This was 12-year-old Christina White, and on the night of April 28, 1979, she had gone to a parade with some friends. At one point, she went back to her friend's house because she was feeling sick. She called her mom and said, "I'm not feeling well, can you come pick me up?" But her mother didn't actually have a car, so she suggested, can you just maybe take a nap at the house and see if you feel better? And then her mother never heard from her again. Now, her mom assumed maybe she started feeling better, went back to the parade with her friends. But when she tried calling the friend's house, they said she already left on her bike. As a matter of fact, witnesses would later say they saw Christina White biking down a road which would be on the way back to her house. But Christina never got home. She never called. She literally just vanished. To this very day, Christina and her bike have never been found. And her case went very, very cold very fast. This was 22-year-old college senior student Kristen David. On the early evening of June 26, 1981, she was in Moscow, Idaho, and she was going to get on her bike and do a 32-mile trip to her home in Lewiston. Kristen never made it home. No one ever heard from her again. There were no witnesses who said, yeah, I saw her, blah, 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 nothing. July 4th, 1981, the reason why no one saw her again, she was found dismembered in the Snake River. And this is in the Clarkston, Washington area. Her body parts were wrapped in black trash bags, and they were found at different points of time and different locations of the river. But eventually they were all confirmed to be that of Kristen David. Her cause of death was unknown. Her case would go very, very cold, very, very fast. This was 35-year-old Stephen Persall. He worked at the Lewiston Civic Theater as a custodian. 21-year-old Christina Nelson, she worked at that theater with him. And then this was her stepsister, 18-year-old Jacqueline Miller. Well, on the night of September 12th, 1982, Stephen would be dropped off at the theater to do some laundry because the theater allowed employees to do that. He did not have his own vehicle. And after everything was done, he left the theater, and then he was never seen again. There were no witnesses that said they saw something happen with him. I'm sounding like a broken record here. He was not the only person to disappear that night. Christina Nelson and Jacqueline Miller, they too vanished that same night. The two of them were over at Christina Nelson's apartment. They decided to go to a nearby grocery store to get some snacks. And then they were never seen again. On March 19th, 1984, the bodies of both women were found. They were found about 35 miles away from where they were last seen. Stephen Persall has never been found. Police initially said, well, okay, well, maybe Stephen is the guy we're looking for who did this to them. But somehow, some way, they were actually able to clear him of any wrongdoing and clear him as a suspect. How they came across that notion, I don't know. Police would come to the conclusion that all three were kidnapped that night, which would lead them to a person of interest. A fellow employee at the theater, Lance Voss. Well, he was apparently a shady person, kind of questionable individual, rubbed people the wrong way, and police would question everyone at the theater because, you know, the victims were all from there. He was the only one to refuse to take a polygraph test. But police never had any actual evidence to connect him directly to anything about this case. Be nice, Mike, be nice. Don't make fun of serial killers. You look like a melted frying pan! This is Henry Lee Lucas, the confession killer. At one point, he was considered a suspect because, you know, when all else fails, it may be him, or an owl. But they were able to rule him out as well. Eventually, police came to the conclusion that all 5 of these victims were done in by the same individual. Who that person is, however, has never been established. There was such little evidence collected that they've got nothing to really go on. I mean, you have a child and then a man mixed in with 3 adult women. It's very random. But to this very day, this case is very, very ice cold. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State. Today, we're going to Hawaii. What? Viewer discretion is advised. technically, Hawaii's coldest case, or at least its most known coldest case, is that of Lisa Au, but I already covered her story on this page before. And finding information about many other cases unsolved in Hawaii has actually been kind of difficult. They don't see a whole ton of murder, and especially not a whole lot of unsolved murder. But there are some. So what I thought I would do was profile 3 of the cold cases that I can find. Unfortunately, there's not a ton of information on these 3. Oh, we'll start with the murder of Glenn Guaro. On August 12th, 1996, shortly before 4 p.m., Glenn's body would be found. His body was just thrown on the side of a road, and it appeared that he had been shot at least once. Earlier in the day, he was witnessed at a place called Shipman Park. The witnesses saw him in the passenger side of a pickup truck. However, the person driving the car has never been formally or properly identified. There's not even a composite drawing of this person that I can even find. And the description of the pickup truck is pretty much non-existent as well. In fact, police don't even know if this pickup truck driver has anything to even do with this, but they did release this information publicly, and this person never came forward to say, hey, yeah, that was me, but I didn't do anything. So who knows? But as of now, this is an unsolved murder with very few leads and very few details. The next unsolved case is that of Matthew Peak. On June 1st, 1999, around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, on a beach in Waipahu Valley, I'm so sorry if I said that wrong, beachgoers would find the human remains of someone, but it was sort of buried haphazardly in the sand, and it was pretty badly decomposed. They were able to determine the cause of death, however, was from asphyxiation, and they were likely strangled to death, and they were eventually able to identify the body as that of Matthew Peak. The only information police really have released is that he was a known hitchhiker in the area, and was, you know, basically seen with sometimes shady characters, but they virtually have nothing. Nothing that they have really released to the public, at least. They just know that he was murdered. They tried to bury his body on a beach, and that's about it. That's all they got. Finally, this is the case of Lynn Ebisuzaki. On May 1st, 1987, sometime in the evening, she was spending time with her boyfriend, and then they were done hanging out, I guess, for the evening, and so she left the apartment, and then 45 minutes later, her body was found just about 100 yards or so away from the apartment building she left, and she was witnessed by people physically leaving the apartment. And I guess this is in the South Hilo or South Hilo area. Her body was just thrown in some bushes, and she was stabbed one time, and that was fatal. Now, of course, the boyfriend was investigated, and honestly, to this day, they still haven't ruled him out, but they also don't have any physical evidence to connect him directly to this murder. But they're just so, it's very strange because she didn't get very far, so who would have just been so brazen to just take her right there from her boyfriend's house, kill her, and then dump her in some bushes in the same apartment complex? Lynn was a very well-to-do person. She never got in any trouble. By all accounts, her boyfriend wasn't anyone who got in trouble. She was very well respected. She was loved by so many people, and everyone was just like, there's nothing Lynn did in her life that would lead her to something like this happening. So this had to be random, or it's the boyfriend, but Why dispose of her in his own apartment complex? That just seems strange to me. Again, police have very little. They have no real witness testimony. They have no real physical evidence, no fingerprints, no extra DNA left behind, nothing. And that is it for the state of Hawaii. There are a few more unsolved cases. I might make another video about, Hawaii specifically. Go ahead and please subscribe to my YT page, YouTube. I'm gonna be daring and say it. The link is in my bio. It's in my link tree. The link is very easy to find everywhere. So I am posting very long videos over there, between 20 minutes sometimes, 35 minutes other times. So I'm going to be posting there very regularly, 3 days a week. So please go subscribe and check it out. And I will be back with another video on this TikTok page later today. Alrighty, bye. Oh. Hello, crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State. Today we are going to Georgia. And this is the case of Levi Frady. Viewer discretion is advised. Levi was an 11-year-old boy who had a twin sister, and they lived in Forsyth County, Georgia. On the early afternoon of October 22nd, 1997, Levi would get home from school, and then he had plans to go to a friend's house to do some studying. At approximately 4:15 that afternoon, Levi would get on his red bike and begin his trip to his friends. From stand, Levi got to the friend's house and they invited him to have dinner with them. So Levi would call his home, but I guess his mother was in the bathtub, so his twin sister answered. And I guess the mother said no and told Levi to come home, so he allegedly left the friend's house. But Levi never got home. And he hadn't gotten home sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning. The mother assumed he just slept at the friend's house. Kind of weird, I guess, to me. I think I would be in a super panic mode. But everyone reacts differently. At any rate, he was reported missing the following day. A couple of days later, Levi's bike was spotted just lying down in some grass relatively close to where he lived. The bike was his mother and by his twin sister. No sign of Levi. The bike, when police got a hold of it, it appeared to have been wiped clean, meaning there was no fingerprints or anything on it. But at this point, they believe Levi was abducted from this site. And then a couple of days after that, 2 hunters would discover the body of Levi Frady here in Dawson Forest. He had been shot a couple of times, and it appeared that where he was found was also where he was killed. I don't see any reports that suggest he was sexually assaulted in any way. Not to say it didn't happen or that wasn't the intent, I don't see anything about it. Unfortunately, ever since that day, there's really been no major forward movement in figuring out who did this. Not one witnessed or heard the young boy being abducted. These are composite drawings of witnesses who were seen in the same area the bike was found and also at the forest during the same exact time frames that Levi would have been in that area too. They're not necessarily suspects, these are just people of interest, but no one's ever come forward to identify themselves. There have been thousands of interviews, a lot of people of interest, but to this day, nobody knows who took Levi or who killed the 11-year-old boy. What exactly happened behind the walls of 641 Muriel Court that fateful night is still a mystery to this very day. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State. That's not a cold sound. Oh well. Today, we're going to Florida. Viewer discretion is advised. The Sims family, which consisted of husband Robert, wife Helen, and their 12-year-old daughter Joy, they lived in the suburbs of Tallahassee, Florida. On the evening of October 22nd, 1966, the entire town was basically out watching a local football game. Football games were like a huge deal. Now, they also had two other daughters. One of them was at the football game, the other one was babysitting at another person's home. Robert, Helen, and Joy stayed home that night, one of the few families to do so. When their daughter Norma got home that night, she walked into a bloody nightmare. The TV was on, the football game was on, there were half-drunken cups of coffee on the table, but the family was nowhere in the living room. So Norma slowly made her way to her parents' bedroom, and inside were 3 bodies. Her father, Robert, who worked for the Department of Education, he was shot 1 time through the head. Her mother was also on the bed. She had been shot twice and appeared to have also been stabbed. And then Joy, their 12-year-old daughter, was on the ground of her parents' bedroom. She had been shot and stabbed 6 times, and her underwear was pulled down to her ankles. Now, Helen was not pronounced dead at the scene. As a matter of fact, she died 9 days later, but because she had a bullet lodged in her brain, she was never conscious to tell anyone about what happened. There was no signs of forced entry. Literally nothing was stolen. There was cash on the countertops and expensive jewelry. Not one thing was taken. A neighbor said they thought they heard screams coming around 10:45 p.m. that night. And that's shortly before Nora got home. Police determined that these murders were literally like they just happened. Probably 30-40 minutes before Nora got there. But police had nothing. These people had no enemies. There wasn't any affairs going on. There was nothing out of the ordinary with this family. So why were they targeted? And in such a brutal fashion? At one point, a local pastor was a suspect, but this was mainly through gossip. But video footage from the football game that night proved he could not have been there because he was at the game. But they have no other suspects. This was just a triple homicide with no clear motive. The girl did not appear to be sexually assaulted 50 years later, and it's still unsolved. A woman would walk into this forest to do some research for school, and then she was murdered. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State, and today we are going to Delaware. Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was 28-year-old Jane Pritchard, and she was actually studying at the University of Maryland, and she was going for her master's degree. And the master's that she was going for was in botany. She loved plant life, but she really ultimately wanted to be an environmental lawyer. In 1986, Jane was working on a very large project for her botany class, and it was almost due, and she was almost done with it too. On the morning of September 20th, 1986, she would get into her Blazer and head to a nearby forest. Specifically, this is the Blackbird State Forest in Delaware. She parked her car, and then she kind of headed into the forest, armed with everything she needed to do her research, including a journal. She kept very, very detailed notes in her journal, and she time-stamped everything. Later that same afternoon, 2 campers had gone into the forest, and they had passed by her Blazer, which was parked on the side of the road, and then about 30-40 feet down, they found her body. She was partially clothed, and she appeared to have been shot in the back. When police were called and the coroner checked on her, it was confirmed that she was shot and killed with a shotgun. There doesn't seem to be any indication that she was sexually assaulted, or at the very least, there was no evidence left behind of an assault of that nature. They did, however, find a strand of hair on her that did not match hers. There was nothing stolen from her vehicle. They found all of her belongings, including her journal, which stopped exactly at 10 a.m., and then nothing after that. An unnamed Good Samaritan would come forward to say that he saw her near a squirrel hunter. He wasn't sure if the squirrel hunter had anything to do with it, but police became more suspicious of the Good Samaritan himself. They would actually bring him in for questioning, and some of his stories were not adding up. He kept changing his story. So they actually would end up arresting him for the murder of the young woman. But then, after about 10 months in prison, they discovered that the hair found on her body did not match the man whatsoever, so they had to let him go. Now, this Good Samaritan gave this description of the squirrel hunter he said was near her, but police have never found this man, or they don't even know if he actually exists. The motive of this crime is completely unknown because there's no evidence of a robbery, no evidence of an actual sexual assault. Did maybe she see something she wasn't supposed to? It's unknown. They reopened this in 2015, but they still have nothing, and her case is very much unsolved. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State. Today we're going to Connecticut. We're almost done with the list. To those who don't know, I'm doing this series backwards alphabetically, so if you click the playlist below, you should see all the cases from Connecticut backwards. This is the case of Mary Badaracco. Viewer discretion is advised. Mary Badaracco was married to a man by the name of Dominic, and they had 2 daughters. And they lived in the Sherman area of Connecticut. Dominic was basically an abusive husband, an abusive father, and Mary would usually have to get the girls out of the house when she realized that he was about to start beating on her. By 1984, apparently the word divorce came into the conversation, and allegedly Dominic was going to give her $100,000 and she would just leave. Well, on August 19th, 1984, Dominic alleges he came inside the house after work and Mary was just gone. He claims she took the $100,000 and then left everything else. She left her wedding ring and the car keys on the counter, and her car was in the driveway, and apparently the window was smashed. And then, a few days after she left, her car then vanished from the driveway. It has never been found. Mary would be reported missing by her family, but Dominic wouldn't report her missing because he claimed she went away on her own accord. The family wasn't buying it. And then in 1986, police would receive an anonymous tip from a former Hells Angels member. This person told police that Joe Badaracco, who was Dominic's son from another marriage, that he whacked Mary, and he did so with the help of another gang member. However, police have never been able to substantiate that claim. They've never been able to find any proof. In 1990, her case moved from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation. Her husband Dominic was always on the radar. By 2009, police said, Dominic Badaracco is our suspect. He has a history of cheating on his wives. He has a history of beating his wives. So a grand jury began to investigate him. And then Judge Robert Brunetti got a call from Dominic. Allegedly, Dominic offered him $100,000 to squash this grand jury investigation. He immediately told authorities, and then Dominic was arrested for trying to bribe a judge. In 2013, Dominic was convicted of that bribery charge. But a formal murder indictment has still not occurred. He still has not been charged with anything, and Mary is still missing. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State, and I wish it would be Arizona already because it's still hotter than balls here. Anyway, today is taking us to the state of Colorado. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, technically, the coldest case that I could probably mention from Colorado is a little-known one called the JonBenet case, but I've already covered her story. And then finding another cold case with a lot of information has been very difficult. So, here is a series of cases that are cold, that have yet to be solved, and have very little information, unfortunately. This was 30-year-old Maria Abitiello Smith. She was reported missing by family on November 20th, 1977. Unfortunately, 6 days after her disappearance, her body had been discovered in an open field. Her exact cause of death was not revealed, but they did say that her manner of death was homicide. That is all the information, however, that has been released. So if you know any information about her case, please contact the Denver Police Department. This was 23-year-old Karen Denise Aguilera. She was last seen alive on September 17th, 1987. It wouldn't be until May 10th, 1988 that her skeletal remains were found in a field. They were unable to determine her cause of death, but again, her manner of death appears to have been homicide. If you have any information about her case, you would contact the El Paso Sheriff's Department in Colorado. Next up is 59-year-old Margaret Albo. On May 31st, 1991, the 59-year-old was found dead in a vacant lot. The lot was between Welton and Glenarm Streets, and it was by Lawson Park. The night before she was discovered deceased, she had been spending time at a restaurant called the Denver Grill. And that was actually pretty close by to where she was eventually found, and she was found strangled to death. Margaret left behind 6 children. If you have any information with regards to her case, you can also contact the Denver Police Department. And finally, we have 36-year-old Ricky L. Allen. His murder case is very strange. He lived in Colorado Springs, Colorado, and he was found inside his own apartment. He was found on March 18th, 1991 by a friend sometime around 11:15 p.m. He had a single gunshot wound to his head, and he had a cocked gun in his hand. But after a very thorough investigation and using forensics and probabilities, they were able to determine that he was not the one to fire the gun. It was a staged self-unaliving. Ricky was very involved in the drug scene there in Colorado, so police think it's somehow linked to that, but they have no idea who killed him. If you have information, call the Colorado Springs Police Department. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State. Today, we are going to Arkansas. Yeehaw! Viewer discretion is advised. Pictured here was 14-year-old Robin Lynn Farnsworth, and she was born on September 11th, 1979. By the age of 14, she would end up having her own baby. On January 27th, 1995, she would leave her high school in Bald Knob, Arkansas, and she would never get home. Now, Robin had tried running away in the past, and usually she came home after a couple of days, but after 4 days of not being home, her mother finally reported her missing. Unfortunately, no one seemed to really care. There was no big, community search for Robin. They all just basically thought, she's a runaway, she'll come back. So let's just move on, basically. And that's what the community did. And then on March 8th, 1995, a classmate of Robin Farnsworth, her name was Kenyatta Haynes. She was an 18-year-old cheerleader who went to the same high school as Robin. Well, then she would vanish after leaving school one day. She was reported missing right away, and the community went crazy searching for her. They were all over, looking through the woods and everywhere. Unfortunately, 2 days later, they would find her body lying in a creek. The report that came out said that she was stabbed repeatedly and that she was not sexually assaulted. The next day, these 2 young individuals were arrested for her murder. I'm not 100% sure how they got to this, but they got to it quickly. This was 17-year-old James Derrick Grubbs and 18-year-old Donnie Ray Temple. So Mr. Temple would tell police what happened. He said James had picked him up for school, and then in the back of his truck was a person, and it was Kenyatta Haynes. Now, she wasn't deceased, but James told him that he had already sexually assaulted her. So then they would drive her to the creek where she eventually would be found, and James reportedly bashed her over the head with a shovel. So she wasn't stabbed, and she was sexually assaulted. The initial reports were way wrong. While in prison, Temple told a guard that James had told him how he murdered Robin Farnsworth. Temple then said, here's where you could find her body because I saw her body. When police got to that area, they said there was a little patch of ground that looked like there was some decomposition going on, and they think they found a bone or 2, but no actual full body. So police just gave up, that they were done. And crazy enough, Robin's mother was like, I actually still think she's alive. I don't think she's dead, so I don't think these 2 boys had anything to do with her disappearing. I mean, and police were like, I don't think these are connected at all. 2 girls from the exact same school get basically kidnapped from their school within a couple of months of each other, and they're not connected. Okay, Jesus criminy. And then, on December 28th, 1997, Two hunters were hunting in a nearby wood in Arkansas, and they found a human skull. The skull was only 100 yards away from where Temple had said Robin's body would have been. So police literally only checked that one spot and didn't branch out. Then there was a whole lot of rigmarole with this body being found. Robin's mom still said, it's not her, it's not her. The cops are like, well, we'll have it examined, but then they didn't examine it, and then they put it into a box, and they just sort of hid it away, and then it was never identified. And then they wouldn't end up being identified until 2003. And they were confirmed that to belong to Robin Farnsworth. And Robin's mom was still like, I don't think those two boys did it. I just don't think they did. Because I could have sworn I saw Robin after they were arrested, so. Even though one of them literally told you where she was. And that is basically where she was. These two men would go on trial for the murder of Kenyatta, and they were found guilty, and they were originally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But then, of course, because one of them was a minor at the time, and it's cruel and unusual punishment to sentence a minor to life without parole, 17-year-old at the time, James, was resentenced to life in prison with parole after 30 years. Temple, he was 18 at the time, so his sentence stayed life without parole. But the guy who physically killed the girl, and probably girls, well, he gets off with a slap on the wrist, basically. The town has since named May 3rd Kenyatta Haynes Day, which is awesome. But Robin Farnsworth? Nothing. She's been forgotten. The boys have never been charged with or anything for her murder. And as far as they're concerned, it's a cold case. It's unsolved. Yeah. And I guess at this point, it never will be solved, will it? No. Hello, true crimerers. It is time for another Coldest Cases by State. And today we're going to Arizona. My dog is trying to dig her way out of the house. Viewer discretion is advised. I'm doing this series backwards alphabetically, so yes, we are almost at the very end. Click the playlist below to see the rest. Because odds are, yes, I've done your state. Pictured here was 16-year-old Pauline Robin Burgett, and she would go by Robin to everyone. In March of 1978, Robin's younger brother, Chad, who was 11 years old, had gone out of town with their mom. So Robin was home alone, but she had told her mom that she would be going to stay with a friend while they were gone. But unfortunately, that did not appear to be the case. On March 12, 1978, Chad and his mother would come home from their weekend trip. And when they entered the house, they saw a nightmare. Robin had been murdered. She was stabbed a number of times, and there was just blood everywhere. When police were investigating this, they would come to the conclusion that there was likely two people other than Robin in the house when this murder took place, because they were able to take DNA off of Robin that wasn't hers, and that they were able to, in 1978 at least, distinguish was from two separate people based on the blood types, or DNA types. Now, in the years since, and we're talking well over 40 years at this point, they have ran that DNA through, much more advanced systems where we can pinpoint exactly who it is, but the DNA samples, which they have confirmed are two different people, two different men, have never matched a single person ever. Police believe that this assailant or assailants were probably someone Robin knew and willingly let inside of her house. It was sort of known that Robin was friends with a lot of boys, and she had, a few ex-boyfriends. There was also a rumor of an older gentleman who was kind of creepy towards her, but I believe he was looked at and was, I think, ruled out. But unfortunately, nobody witnessed anything happening. No one heard anything happening. And the DNA, like I said, has never matched anyone. And that's really all they have. They have no other evidence. And they're really just speculating on this is probably someone she knew. But they can't really say that for certainty. 4 years later, their mother passed away. and she never got answers. If for some reason you have any information and this took place in Phoenix, Arizona, please call Silent Witness at 480-948-6377 if you know anything.